Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's presentation. My name is Adam Krieger, and I'm with Warren Township Youth and Family Services. This evening, we're very excited to have our good friends from Willow House here to do a presentation called Parenting While Grieving During COVID-19 and Beyond. Sadly, we are all probably dealing with some kind of grief in our lives, and so this is a very timely workshop, and we're so happy to have them here with us. We will be recording this workshop, and we'll certainly be taking questions during the workshop. Just to let you know, the way we'll handle the questions is please feel free to send us questions in the chat box. And then every now and then, Lauren will take a break, our presenter, and I will go ahead and then feed her those questions. So let me go ahead and get us started. Our presenter this evening is Lauren Wozniak. She is the program director over at Willow House. Lauren has her master's degree in counseling and art therapy from Adler University. She's a licensed clinical professional counselor and a registered art therapist. So with no further ado, Lauren, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Warren Township, as well for having me speak to you all. I'm very excited to bring this conversation to everyone. And I know it can be weird to hear someone being excited about grief and loss. With that being said, the excitement comes from just being able to share this really important knowledge and education to all of you. And I look forward to your questions throughout the presentation. And so my goal for this evening tonight is to provide an understanding of grief and loss, including non-death losses, as well as to provide some information and guidance on how to support grieving children and teens, and lastly, to give space and a voice to you all as parents while grieving, which parenting while grieving can be one of the hardest things that you may endure. So just a little bit about our history here at Willow House. We've been around since 1998, and our founder, Stephanie Norris, created Willow House when she saw a lack of support for children and families that were grieving. We have been a go-to program in our area in Illinois for grief and loss for quite a while. Back in 2001, we had the chance and opportunity to work with families grieving losses due to 9/11. And even though, you know, that 9/11 tragedy has been a while since it has happened, we feel like it's really prepared us to help you all the best we can during this crisis of the pandemic. Briefly about our services that we provide in case any of you all are interested. We support families and children as young as 3 years old, all the way up to our adults, where we have a child loss and a spouse loss group. These groups are split apart by age so that children and teens, young adults, and adults can all meet with people their own ages, their own developmental level, to talk about grief and loss in a safe and structured way. We also have our Survivors of Suicide Loss group, and this is open to many different types of relationships to the person who has died. And I should mention that our general support groups are open to the loss of a child, a parent, a sibling, or a spouse. And lastly, we have our Expressive Arts group, which is an entire group just for the family all together, where we use the creative process to explore feelings and emotions and honor each other's loved ones. Willow House can also provide assessments and consultations to families if you have any, just specific questions you might want to ask about your grief and loss. And lastly, we can refer out to the community. We have a large list of counselors and therapists that specialize in grief that do the individual counseling work. So we would be happy to provide you with information for that as well. All of our services are free, and all of our services are provided and facilitated by clinical Willow House staff members as well as trained volunteers. And in addition to our peer support groups for families, we also have our school program. So this is where we can provide consultation to the school staff, teachers, counselors, anybody within the school setting, We can, again, answer questions and kind of give them guidance. We can also respond to a crisis within a school if there's the death of a teacher or a parent or a student. And we can also do these types of educational presentations like I'm offering for you guys tonight. We can do that within the school setting. And lastly, we offer 8-week peer support groups. If there are enough students in the school setting that are grieving at this time, we can provide this 8-week group. And currently all of our services are being held virtually. So our first topic that we're going to look at is just understanding grief and loss. What is grief? I want you to take a moment to reflect for yourself on what grief may mean to you, to what loss might mean to you, whether it's the death of a person or the loss of a job, loss of support systems. Just kind of thinking about, how has this grieving process been feeling? Kind of hold on to that as we move throughout the presentation. So understanding grief. Grief is normal and it's natural. It's not an illness and it's not a disease. Grief is universal and all of us will experience it at some point in our lives. Grief is also very personal. It belongs to the person who is grieving. There's no right or wrong way to be grieving, and no one can tell you what to expect or offer you a guide to grief, because every relationship to your grief and to your deceased person is very unique. So no two people are going to be grieving the same way. And one of the difficult things about grief is that we don't really know what it's going to be like unless we are in the grief and grieving ourselves. Grief is also transitional, and therefore children and even adults need that time and the space to explore their new reality when loss occurs. Grief is also seen and unseen. I like to think of an iceberg where there is just the tip poking out of the water, but underneath there's the large, boulder of ice that we can't usually see. So some people are very expressive and allow you to see, what's underneath. And some people are more withdrawn and private, where you might only get to see that tip of the iceberg sticking out of the water. And again, grief is enduring. We can grieve for a lifetime. We unfortunately don't magically wake up one day feeling recovered from our loss, even though we might really want it to be working that way. We don't want to forget our loved ones. We don't want to let go. And our grief for our children and for adults is going to continue to change and evolve over time. So it's important to know that there's not one perfect way to cope with grieving. But with children particularly, using arts and creativity and play and body language is going to be really important, which I'll talk more about later into our presentation. So here I want to address COVID-19 and our non-death losses. During this time of the pandemic, we can't be talking about grief if, without talking about all of these other types of non-death losses here. There can be a financial loss, a reduced compensation in pay, and with that can come stress and struggles. We can grieve that loss of a job if we had really close coworkers, or the loss of finances where we have to shift the way that we act day to day. There's also the loss of choosing our daily patterns, the loss of freedom, of just being able to go out, go to the mall, go to a park. These things are also, somewhat taken away from us. And so we can grieve as well that unpredictability, that sense of not having control over what our day-to-day is going to look like. There's also the loss of having a sense of safety and a sense of peace, whether it's the sense of safety with, not being able to see the virus. It's this looming presence everywhere that we go. we can't see it. And that especially will make it difficult for children to understand what COVID-19 really means and what it's all about at this time. There's also the loss of sense of safety and peace due to our justice and unrest right now in our communities. And earlier in COVID, when we had riots happening and people standing up for their beliefs, and there's just a large sense of the unknown of what might happen next. And then we think about, will things go back to the way they were? That is a large piece of just uncertainty. Even when we lose a person, some people might wish, I hope that, I want things to go back to the way they are. I want things to go back to the way they were. And we can say that now during the pandemic. And this can be a loss, knowing that things won't be exactly how they once were. And another aspect to our losses right now are just our assumptions of what our world was going to be like, what our life was going to be like, what our future plans were. Just not being certain, as maybe that you have a teenager at home who is planning to go to college in the fall, or maybe they were supposed to go right now and things have changed and their, predictions to their next steps in life have been altered. And then lastly, looking at how non-death losses can be disenfranchised. And what that means is that disenfranchised grief is all about someone's grief not feeling adequate enough, someone's grief not feeling important enough. So when looking at trying not to compare one's grief, if someone has lost their job, but down the street, your neighbors have lost their grandmother, some might feel like, I shouldn't grieve my job because someone's person has died. But I'm here to tell you that all types of grief and all types of loss are valid, and you're allowed to have these feelings of grief. So next here, I want to look at some myths and misperceptions about grief, and a little bit more specifically about childhood grief. The number one thing that I want to point out here is the idea that grief has orderly stages. Kubler-Ross created the stages of grief, and over time it has been proven that these stages don't actually exist, in a straight line, in an order. Even Kubler-Ross has made the statement where she wishes she would not have labeled it as stages. It's been found that, yes, you may still experience, the denial and the bargaining and the depression, but they might ebb and flow. You might experience depression, anger, acceptance, depression, acceptance, who knows? Each person's way that they're going to be reacting is unique to the individual. So that's where I love this diagram here on the slide of showing how we want it to work. We want it to start from beginning to end and be clean and done. But in actuality, it is a starting point, lots of loops, lots of ups and downs, and then that arrow just keeps going because grief will be with us for the rest of our lives. However, the intensity and what we feel will change. I also want to address here that, the grief of adults does not have an impact on the bereaved child. Where actually children really do look up to their adult, to their caregiver, to see how they are grieving. Adults become the model, and the children are learning from you and from the caregivers on what's appropriate to grieve. So I'm here to say, if you feel like crying and it's in front of your children, that's okay. It shows them that crying can be healthy and cathartic. Also addressing that, infants and toddlers are too young to grieve. We know now that, children, even if they can't verbalize and label and put a word to it, they can definitely feel it within their bodies. Young children might cling to the existing caregiver more often. They might be a little bit more needy. They might be more irritable. So even the really young babies can feel grief in some sense. And so there are a lot of myths and misperceptions here, but I am happy to address more if you guys have any questions on them.
At this time, I don't have any specific questions, but one general question, um, are, and you may hit on this later, but the issue of divorce and parent separation.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when we went through the economic hardships in 2008, 2009, definitely saw a lot of divorce, separation. Um, will you be talking specifically about that when you hit the children's section later?
I will not be talking specifically about divorce, but I do believe that a lot of these ideas and ways to work with children in grief can definitely be applied to the grief of divorce or the grief of deployment and things like that. And so, yes, not directly, but again, happy to continue answering any questions when we get to that piece too, related to divorce, but also happy to maybe set up a consultation with our panel participant
Great,
if she has
thank you.
further questions. Yeah. Okay, so starting to look at some of the factors that play into grief. We've added some here, during the time of COVID. And looking at things like, were you able to say goodbye to your person who has died? How has e-learning been going? Does that play a role into maybe your stress or family life? If maybe you all as caregivers and parents are helping with that e-learning and helping them school. What is the age of the person grieving? Is there a restricted physical support system due to COVID? What is someone's developmental stage and maturity? Looking at people's personality, prior losses, trauma, relationship to the deceased, all of these things here that you see on the screen play into what it is that the grieving person might feel and how they're going to react. One of the important pieces, like why we address these, is that we want to know what else is going on. I think about grief sometimes in layers. There's the person who died, but then there might be other stressors underneath. And how we respond to our grief is going to be affected by these other factors. And so kind of going along with that, looking at secondary losses. And a secondary loss is an additional loss to what our assumptive world is, a loss to what we thought, life might be like, the loss from death and from different crises. So there can be the loss of the self, security, and meaning. I love this diagram. I think it explains it really well to show, our center and the core of what might be happening for us can result in these, outside losses. And then we have grief that kind of encompasses everything. And I think right now during the pandemic, I can see that purple circle just having COVID in there. That can absolutely be, our main focus that causes these additional losses outside of that. And so it's important for parents and caregivers to know about these secondary losses, not only for themselves and what they're experiencing, but also for the children. We want to address these types of losses and help them to find coping, help them to find ways to work through some of these different losses so that they can be, well adjusted and have a healthy coping pattern for future events. And so I mentioned some of these, but kind of just, touching base again on possible losses during COVID. There can be that loss of the daily routine and predictability, our loss of our in-person support system, especially if kids are now, whether they had gone into school and now they're back home or they've been home this entire time, there's the lack of school support in the physical sense, the lack of seeing their teacher every day, of getting a hug, just lack of seeing grandparents and extended family. There can be the loss of a job, loss of planning for the future, and kind of what our expectations have been. There's also the loss of rituals and just having things change in when someone dies. Funerals might not be able to take place, or they might be a virtual funeral. Our rituals look different now, can look different, but I think one of the most important pieces is looking to the core of what does that ritual mean for you and your family? Is there a way that we can adjust it? And I say this a lot too with the holidays coming up. Our traditions and what we know of our holidays and how we want them to look will be different this year in one way or another. But we want to, again, keep in mind, what is that core meaning? Why do we, bake these chocolate chip cookies every year? Why do we put the silly ornament on the tree? If there's parts that are restricted, maybe how can we adapt? How can we change it in a positive way? Or how can we put it through Zoom to still be with our families? So I am going to pause here before we talk about grieving children and teens. I know there's a few things coming up in the chat, so just taking a look at that.
Yeah, I don't think we have a specific question. I've just been talking to one of the participants.
Okay.
Great.
Well, I will move on then. So we're going to be looking at supporting grieving children and teens. And so we do have on our website for Willow House, which I will show you guys later, the link to that. We have a section on there that breaks down the developmental stages of grief. I would have loved to go through it with you this evening, although just due to time, I'm going to steer you towards our website to check out the developmental stages. And so it breaks it down from infant to 3 years old, 4 years old to 7. So breaking it down to be what are some common, reactions and how can we help them? But just here in a little bit more of a general sense, it can be assumed that children might not be affected because they're too young to fully comprehend what's going on around them. However, children and teens have more awareness than most adults usually realize. Even if they do not fully understand what's happening, they're being impacted on many levels. This impact of loss can be interpreted from limited experiences and understanding, and children, and it'll affect them, over many years. And as we talk more about the development and grief, keep in mind that these common reactions are generalizations and that they might not be applicable to everybody. So when death occurs, children of all ages feel what most adults feel. Mostly they just express it differently, more through actions than with their own words. So some common emotional reactions that children and teens might experience are sadness, sorrow, fear, insecurity, ambivalence, perhaps apathy, kind of a lack of expression, feeling guilty, regret, shame, shock, anger, and frustration. Some children and teens may cry, and some may not at all. Some other reactions can be, changes in eating, lack of concentration, maybe being a little bit more withdrawn, feeling restless, perhaps feeling more clingy to the caregivers or to their friends. They might hide in their grief, so not really showing it, or they might act out more. You might see it in the forms of aggression or verbal acting out. And this can be sometimes because they don't have the exact language or way to express what it is that they're feeling. There can also be physical reactions to grief, such as headaches and fatigue and muscle tension, and having tight or heavy chest pains and stomach pains. And in teens, we often see something that could be called splitting, where they may act one way in front of their peers, but they might act another way in front of their parents. just saying, you know, I'm fine, or I don't care, this doesn't matter to me. It could be a way for them to be kind of protecting themselves or backing away for this situation so that it doesn't feel as intense. And again, this is just a possibility that may happen. Teens might also strive for perfectionism and just to wanting to have this responsibility and feeling of being strong, like they should be stepping up to care for their existing parent if a parent has died. They may want to take on more of an adult role within the family. But what's important to remind kids and teens at any age is that they are allowed to continue being those kids and teens. Sometimes it's called parentification, where they try to, you know, act and take care of the family as well. But again, just giving that nice, consistent confirmation that they can, you know, play outside, they can be kids. And so all children need consistent check-ins and some gentle monitoring from their parents and caregivers. And it's really hard to see our children in pain. Loving them means, you know, tolerating our own discomfort so that they heal within our embrace and with the presence of their caring adult. So these are a few things to consider, you know, inside of the grieving heart. Things that, you know, can be maybe expected, maybe people won't experience this. Again, there's no right or wrong to the grieving process. So this is really just a slide of validation. To know that it's okay for you or your children to feel really tired, but maybe you have no energy. It's okay to be more bright and alert. It's okay to be lonely, but it's okay to also want to be alone. It's okay to talk about your person who has died. And it's okay to also not want to think about your person for a little bit, or maybe take a break from that constant thought process. There can be feelings of feeling like you're responsible for what has happened, or feeling as though you can't be responsible for everything. It can be a confusing time for some people. There can be daydreaming, there can be difficulty concentrating, the feelings of no one gets it. And just to point on that one, that is one of the reasons why Willow House exists, is to show people that there are other people out there that get it. There's a community of grieving individuals out there who have experienced something similar. And we want to provide that community and that hope to others that you're not alone through this grieving process. It's okay to wonder what's next after someone dies. It's okay to feel guilty because you are alive. And it's also okay to feel guilty when you smile or laugh. And it's really okay to smile and laugh in these moments of joy when you feel them. Some people might cry, and some people don't cry at all, and that's okay. And it's okay to ask why. It's okay to ask questions in general. So looking at promoting health and resilience within our children. The parent and child relationship does not have to be perfect, but we do want there to be positivity, warmth, authenticity, and acceptance between child and parent or caregiver. There's also the expression of validation and grief. Again, all of those things I listed in the previous slide, we want our children to know that what they are experiencing is okay and that it is valid. Sometimes I have a question about discipline and grief. And with loss, the child might test limits and boundaries. And it's important to know that you hear them loud and clear and that you still want to provide them with some discipline that is warm and consistent. Something one of my coworkers mentioned to me is thinking about the word ACT, A-C-T. So that's acknowledging the feelings and desires, communicate the limit, and target acceptable alternatives. depending on the age of the child. So thinking about, if a child is acting out or feeling disruptive or having a difficult time, know that even through the grieving process, it is okay to still keep our routines, to keep boundaries, and to keep discipline in the sense of act, acknowledge, communicate, target behaviors. And so again, talking about routines, it's easier to let things slide when someone dies because the whole family is grieving together. But structure and consistency is really important and essential for families. Keeping these daily and weekly routines are going to have a lifelong positive impact. And you can keep it very simple, just by keeping bedtimes the same, keeping the eating schedule the same. I know during this time of the pandemic, if people are working from home, schooling from home, it's easy to just kind of roll out of bed and come to your desk. But it's most beneficial if you can, still wake up, still brush your teeth, still put on some clean day clothes, treat the day as though you were leaving the house. And that is one type of, mental positivity that just keeps our bodies going forward. This is just another day. I'm still here. I'm still moving along. So keeping those boundaries can be healthy for adults as well. And so trying to keep just as few changes as possible for kids. And if there are big changes that need to happen, perhaps moving due to finances or anything like that, just giving notice about what is coming up can be really helpful. So we also want to have positive communication. After the death of a special person, family members might try to hide their thoughts and feelings from one another as a way to protect each other. But the death can cause shifts in the family roles. So be aware when children are trying to share something. And just listen. Being a listener is going to be key for your family, just allowing people to share and to vent. And if your child wants to talk with you about a silly video or a TV show, they're giving you the opportunity to get to know them better and to kind of hear, their insight on things. And it can also highlight their strengths. We want to highlight the good that you're seeing in your children, such as when they clean up without asking, and acknowledging the efforts that they're making. It's also important to keep healthy boundaries. So adults can take care of the family and can take care of adult matters. So knowing the difference between child and adult-sized worries can be important. A kid's job is to go to school, to go to soccer, to spend time with their friends, and it's okay for them to continue being a kid. And then healthy coping mechanisms, which I'll get a little bit further into as well. But we want to give children an outlet and a time to take a break from their grief. Exercising and moving their bodies, being mindful, and breathing skills can be really beneficial. Playing outside at a socially distanced pace, getting enough sleep, creative outlets, all these things are really healthy and important for the entire family. So when we think about communicating with our children who are grieving, any type of loss, why is it important that we're communicating with them? When we provide information to them, it can help them, keep their fears in check. It can help them have a sense of control and might prepare them for future losses. When we give them information, it allows them to not have sometimes what we call magical thinking, where a child might, come up with stories in their minds of why mommy is so sad all the time. If they don't know what happened or what they're struggling with, they might come up with, their own answers. And sometimes it can be worse than what's actually going on. So being truthful and honest with our kids at an age-appropriate level is really beneficial. Now, there can be some hesitations to talking with kids, such as, I don't want to remind them of their loss. Sometimes in actuality, they're probably thinking about their person already, or they're probably thinking about their loss anyways, whether it's brought up or not. So having that open door of communication can be so beneficial, and it might even be relieving for the child to say, finally, I can talk about Dad, and I can share my memories of him. The response of, I don't know, as a parent, that is okay. I want to, validate that to you. Grief is uncharted. It's different for everybody. It's something that, as I just had this discussion today with my coworkers of, it's not something we're born with to know how to respond to grief. It's difficult. So you as the parent, it is okay to say, I don't know that answer right now. Maybe it is something that you want to reach out to Willow House for, to see if we can help you, or talking with your own support systems to find an answer that feels right for you. Parents also might fear that they will break down themselves. And crying is such a great release for people. It's good, it's okay, and young children might actually be more confused about, why isn't mommy crying? Again, you guys are the models for the children. You show them again, there's no right way, but you show them your way of grieving. And when they see you expressing your feelings and they see you talking about your grief, it lets them know that they can also do the same. And then the last one, thinking about, it might be harmful to talk to my children about grief and death. They're so young. Why should I bring this up with them? I don't want to scar them. But keeping it factual, keeping an explanation, a clear explanation about death and dying can actually be really comforting. So allowing children to have this knowledge and this understanding about death can be more helpful than harmful. We want to keep our language concrete, especially if talking to really young children. We want to avoid euphemisms. So saying things like, Grandpa is sleeping, that can be really confusing for young children, because they might say, well, when's he going to wake up? So we want to use the language of dead and dying and death, because that helps to prepare the children now and into the future. So just be honest, be patient, be kind, and be kind to yourself as well. So these are some things that children want us as adults to know. Their grief is long lasting. They're going to cope through grief, with grief through play. They might, they're always going to miss their person who died. Sometimes they'll want to talk, sometimes they won't. They may act out, and that's how they're expressing their emotions. They might feel guilty. And if they don't know what they need, give that, most children give that permission to adults to reach out. This slide is written by a teenager. And these are 15 things that, they hear or have heard, but weren't very helpful. So I'll just give you a moment to kind of glance over that. So some of these are kind of, general statements, things that aren't completely helpful, not very concrete. And so what children need the most is honesty, sense of control, reassurance, validation, and normalization. I like this little box right here, thinking about the child saying, am I doing this right? And a parent just responding, well, what feels good for you? There's no right or wrong in this grief experience. So I'm going to take another pause here before I get into talking about taking care of yourself as the parent and the caregiver. If there's any questions or comments.
So there weren't any questions brought up in the chat line, but I do have one just because it comes up very frequently. I get phone calls about this when I do intakes at youth services.
Mhm.
So, I know sometimes I'll get a call from somebody, a parent, and they'll say, well, my child's grandfather just passed away. And, of course, my kid's very sad. And maybe it's just been a week since since the grandfather died. And do you have any thoughts, any sort of guidelines? And again, maybe you have this coming up, but any guidelines about a couple things. One is there a timeline that's kind of too soon to kind of seek counseling? In other words, do you have any sort of general recommendations about, giving the family time to kind of process a little
Mhm.
bit before jumping to counseling? And then also, are there guidelines where you would say to a parent, are there any timelines where you might say to a parent, yes, I think this is definitely a good time to have your child go into counseling. So I'm kind of looking for some of your guidelines that you would use.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Again, each family will be, a little bit more specific to their circumstances and their scenarios about things. But I guess starting with group support at Willow House, we assess to kind of see, I guess in a general sense, like I think a month could be a possible good, distance from when their person has died. Um, Again, it's going to look different for everybody, but with the group setting, it can feel overwhelming to hear other people's stories of grief and loss. Sometimes that can be too triggering to sit through. So I think someone needs to be willing to be able to hear other stories. We never pressure our families to talk about their loss in the group. If they don't want to, they're welcome to pass or just listen. But I think having some sense of comfortability with sharing is important. Um, for children, I think about, as if they, so kind of, a scenario into another scenario of like a question we get at Willow House will be, my child is sleeping in bed with me every night. Is that okay? And the answer to that is if it's comfortable for both of you and it's not causing any harm, it's not causing any problems, not disrupting, daily routines, then that is okay. For counseling too, like if someone is grieving and it's not affecting, they're not a harm to themselves, they're not a harm to others, um, and the parent sees them expressing, sees them playing, sees them talking about their loved one or person. Again, doesn't have to be verbal talking, it can be that expression through other areas. I think that can be, that those are positive signs. um, so I think mostly just like when it's, it's different things of what they're looking for. If they want that peer support and knowing that there's other people out there, then yeah, definitely like groups can be beneficial. But if it's more of a clinical issue or, behavioral problems due to grief, that can be a time to seek extra support.
I appreciate that. I do have one quick question for you from a participant.
Mhm.
This is the question: does Willow House staff go into people's homes to provide counseling? I assume during COVID, you're probably not going to people's homes, but under normal conditions, do you guys do home visits?
We do not. We do hold all of our groups either at our office in Bannockburn. We have in Arlington Heights, Libertyville, and Chicago Lakeview locations where we used rented out spaces from churches and synagogues. And one thing too, just to note that our services are, we don't do any individual counseling, and even our groups, we call them peer support groups. So just slightly different than specific like group counseling. Whereas we really want our peers and our participants to kind of lead that conversation and the topics for the evening. And we use our facilitators to help kind of guide the family members along. That is a good question. And I do see one other question about someone who mentioned their husband died 2 months ago. And first of all, I'm I'm so sorry to hear about that, but thank you for being vulnerable enough to share that with us. And she's asking, how do I get my daughter to connect to her friends more? It's difficult due to the pandemic. And just being at home, she's saying, causes some challenges. Yeah. Does she have access to Zoom and some of the technology? And I'm not saying to go out and, go get a phone, but I know that one of my cousins who has children ended up getting her daughter a phone sooner than she thought because of the pandemic and allowing her on, kids' Facebook Messenger and things like that. I know that it can be really difficult, but for a grieving child right now, it's typical for the parent, for you who have shared this, that she might be confiding in you more, or might finding her support more within you, or her other, trusted adults. But friends are, yes, definitely still so important within her grieving process. So it is a hard answer. I almost don't have a specific, solution for you, just with the restrictions that are happening right now. But I think maybe it's writing letters. That can be, a way, bringing back pen pals during the time of the pandemic. Maybe it's dropping off, a letter at the house, at a friend's house, or a little, I've seen the rocks with smiley faces on them, like a happiness stone or something like that. Kind of thinking outside the box, perhaps, being creative with ways that they can stay connected. Okay. So then taking a look at you all as the grieving parent. Coping is about the whole entire person, the whole body. We can cope, in all of these different ways that you see here in the diagram. But I want you to take a moment and just reflect on, is there an area that you see that might need more attention? Feel free to put in the chat if you're feeling open with sharing, if there's pieces that you see where you could put some more energy towards. So coping with loss, can kind of be on a spectrum here. We've got the two on the side, which is worrying about one's own needs, and then on the other side of the spectrum, throwing all of your time and energy into the needs of your children. Both two of these sides can be seen as maladaptive. And where we want to find ourselves is in the middle, to be an adaptive type of coping, where we're trying to balance our own needs with the needs of our children and our family. And coping really, encapsulates anything that helps you to feel better and gives you a boost of positive emotions. It can be really big things like seeing a therapist, or it can be small things like taking the time to go outside and breathe and just feel the wind on your skin, or maybe walking your dog. So we want, the rationale behind this is that if you feel better, the more strength that you have, it will help you to continue working with your children to process their grief. So this is the dual process model of coping with bereavement. And again, you can kind of see where it's finding that balance of, we have the larger picture of the everyday life experience. And then there's kind of two aspects going on. We're focusing on our grief, but we're also focusing on life and just getting daily tasks done. Unfortunately, when someone dies, life doesn't stop. Bills keep rolling in, school keeps happening, homework piles up. And so we are finding ourselves in this, we see the arrow here, in between balancing, our loss-oriented and our restoration-oriented. Just taking a moment to reflect on maybe some of those experiences that you've had personally. This is the 50 ways to take a break. I love this diagram and worksheet. I actually have it printed out at the office that I share with families. This is a really engaging, just colorful piece of paper to use for yourself or for your kids. You can circle, things that interest you, things you want to do more, but just knowing that really there's no right or wrong to coping as well. I love the top right, it just says watch the clouds. How simple and how rewarding it could be just to be out in nature for even a few moments. So I want to ask you guys, whether you have paper and pen in front of you, feel free to do this, or just mentally processing. Think about these two circles that you see. On the left here, I want you to think about a pie chart and how big of your slices take up the time that what are you working on? What are you doing with your daily life? How much time do you spend coping with your grief? How much time do you spend on activities or enjoyable things that can improve your health? So take a moment to think, what does your pie chart look like? Where are you spending your time? Also, feel free to insert into the chat. And along with that, then in our second circle, how do you want to spend your time? What would you change about where you're focusing your energy on? Would you like to have more time for hobbies, for your spirituality, for taking care of your physical self? I know for myself, I'd love to take more walks. I find myself working a lot. So taking some time throughout the day, even if it's a quick walk around the block, that's something where I would like to shift. Another important piece here is to utilize your support system. Throughout grief, throughout very stressful times, utilize the people that you have. So again, I'm going to read these out loud, these statements, but you can internally think about, maybe there's a person that comes to mind, and it can be the same person each time, or maybe it's somebody different. So think about who you may want it to be or who it is. So who is most likely to listen without judgment? Who in your life is most likely to be patient with me? Who is most likely to be comfortable with silence? Who is most likely to be comfortable while I cry? Who's the most likely to get me out of the house? Who's the most likely to help me sort through my loved one's things? And who's the best at giving practical advice? And when times, families, sometimes people can feel like, oh, I don't have anybody. Who can I rely on? Or my person who died was my person who could answer all of these questions. And that's where, looking and maybe it's expanding your support system, reaching out to people you haven't talked to in a while, especially during the holiday season, knowing who you can talk to, who you can plan things with, even if it's just virtual or a phone call. But our bodies crave human connection. We want to be close and connected. So keep your support system in mind in times of struggle. And then lastly here, I know we're coming down on our time. We are going to look at families all together as a whole. So when death occurs within the family system, the balance between change and stability is disrupted. Everything can be different. Grief affects not only what we do in the family, but the role, like who fills what roles, how the family members can communicate and how the family copes with stress and how the family might see itself. So families might report feelings of being chaotic and out of control, yet the feeling that life has become chaotic is now the predictable part of grief. And when a family is in the midst of this loss, their goals as a family are to reestablish security and acknowledge the experience of grief individually as well as collectively in an effort to continue growing. And children, as I mentioned, look to their caregivers on how to be in the world, especially after their person dies. As an adult, in the child's life, you're such an important piece in helping them know what to do next, how to handle the grief, how to be open and to process verbally. Children look up to you to know that they're not alone in their grief process, or they might turn to some of their friends and their peers as a way to connect and communicate. Just again, allow yourself to let your children know when you feel sad. Be open to discussing all of the hard parts. And by keeping this really authentic and warm and supportive dialogue, you're setting the stage to be able to discuss grief as it changes and as it shifts each day, each week, and over the years. So taking this pressure off of ourselves to have all of the answers and giving ourselves more patience and grace. So here are just a few ideas of some activities that you guys can do together as a family. There's feelings charades. I've done this actually a lot with clients of just having, maybe it's writing down feelings and putting it into a bucket and pulling them out. And then you have to act out what the emotion is and just trying to guess it. This can help teach kids ways to identify their feelings and label what they're experiencing. Coping skills Pictionary, again, a little bit more drawing what the coping skill is, and the family has to guess, what that activity is. There is the I am poem. I found this really popular with teens. If you just Google I am, the poem should pop up on its own, but it's kind of a prompting poem where there's the first couple sentences and then you fill out the rest. It's a really lovely way to get to know more about your kids. Maybe you all as a family fill it out and share it with one another. You'll see in the top right picture is the glitter jar. This is a great coping skill, a coping tool, where you fill water and some hot glue and glitter and you just shake it, and then you just sit and you breathe and you watch the glitter fall to the bottom. This can help us regulate our emotions. We see here in the picture as well the bag full of candles. You might see this at specific 5Ks and walks, but you can do this at your own home as well, using electronic tea lights for safety if you wish, but decorating that bag to be meaningful and to be personable to your person that you may have lost. And that's something similar with, memory boxes, having a place to share and put memories. And then when you see rocks full of feel-good messages, maybe it's a little worry stone or positivity stone, something that your child or teen can carry around with them on a daily basis that has positive words of affirmation. These are a few brief examples of children's artwork that has been done at Willow House. I cannot stress enough how important creativity is and play is for children and teens throughout their grieving process, and just as a way to be aware of their feelings and what's going on for them. They might not verbalize it to you. They might not physically say how they're feeling, but they might put it on paper, where one child, we even had he labeled it for us to say that he was very angry. In the middle, you see one of our family members working on a memory box. And to the right, you see an image that a little girl created after attending a funeral. And this was her way of processing and showing us what she felt and what she gained from that experience. And all of these things are, part of continuing that bond. Our relationship with our person who has died never ends. The relationship lasts the rest of our lifetime. It's just kind of figuring out how, as a family, you are going to continue honoring your person if you wish, how you're going to continue to remember them, how you're going to continue to keep memories alive if that's something that your family is interested in. And creativity can really be that. Maybe it's through cooking their favorite meal. Maybe it's through planting a memory garden. Creativity doesn't have to just be, drawing and painting, but it can be so much more. And lastly, here I have our Willow House website, along with some different resources we have. If you see at the bottom, there's the at-home activities for children, teens, and families. This is a Google Drive we have on our website that is full of worksheets and like handout activities that you guys can print out at home. They're great conversation starters. Some of them help with specific emotions. Some of them are just a little bit more general to processing grief individually or as a family. So please feel free to check those out and use them if you find them useful. And lastly, here is our Willow House contact information, regular email and my email, and it has been such a pleasure. So I'm open to any questions that you guys might have.
At this moment, I don't seem to have any additional questions. I have to say, those last few slides with some of the ideas of things that parents can do with their kids, as well as, and I did not know that you guys provided such a rich resource on your website, so I will be going to look at that very soon. So I thought that was really wonderful. So, I know very often parents will ask me, hey, we've got we've got an anniversary coming up of a loss or something like that. And very often they are looking for those kinds of activities to do with their children.
Yes, absolutely. Anniversaries, holidays, all of these things can be, people want to do something, and sometimes it can be more of a tangible suggestion, and sometimes it's more of like a thought process. Yeah.
Well, listen, I think that probably brings us to our end. It's actually, the timing's perfect. It's just 6:32. Lauren, I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening and providing this presentation. And providing some your insights and as well as some practical suggestions. So again, I'd like to thank our friends at Willow House. I'd like to thank all of you for attending this evening. On behalf of Warren Township Youth and Family Services, have a wonderful, safe, and wonderful evening with your family. Take care. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.